Haniya was killed in Tehran. He was there for the inauguration of Iran's new president. Israel has not taken responsibility for Haniya's death, but it has for the others. Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah have all vowed revenge for the deaths. Now, many countries are encouraging their citizens to leave Lebanon. Airlines are canceling flights, and the U.S. is sending a carrier group and a fighter squadron to the region. Joining me now is Robin Wright, Newyorker writer and fellow at the Wilson Center, and Vali Nasser, professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Vali, let me begin with you and ask you, what does this look like to Iran? Because this has been a pretty aggressive set of moves by Israel.
You're exactly right. I mean, this was seen by them as a deliberate provocation to precipitate a conflict that would ultimately probably bring in the United States into a direct confrontation with Iran. So they saw that in one swoop, Israel, by killing Haniya, killed off the ceasefire deal, which means that the Gaza war will go on. And it also decided to carry out the assassination in Tehran and during the inauguration of an Iranian president, the new Iranian president, which meant that it deliberately wanted to humiliate Iran. And also the Iranians saw it essentially as an attack on that inauguration itself. So it's put Iran in a very difficult position of needing to both retaliate, but also to establish deterrence against Israel, and at the same time also not react in a way that would play exactly into what they think Israel wants, which is a larger conflict.
Robin, does Israel want a larger conflict? It does seem, like it doesn't suggest that they're searching for some kind of stability here. They're punching back hard.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has made clear that he intends to eliminate Hamas as a political entity and as a military threat. And since January, the head of Mossad, David Barnea, has said repeatedly that Israel will go after the major Hamas leaders, as it has been doing steadily. And this, of course, does undermine peace, particularly when you eliminate the chief negotiator with the international community. There are very few winners out of this escalation. Hamas wins because it's always wanted its campaign against Israel to engage or produce a wider war across the region, and that's where it looks like we're headed. And Bibi Netanyahu also distracts the Israeli population from his own political woes and problems in court. So there's a real danger here that you have two sides that, for either military or political reasons, are now likely to engage in a much wider conflict, which is dangerous most of all because it merges the 10 different conflicts playing out in the Middle East into one big one. And that's really hard for the United States as the chief broker to try to unravel.
Vali, the last Iranian counterattack to a punch from Israel was that very elaborate 300-odd missiles and drones which the United States and Saudi Arabia and the UAE all helped thwart off, but mainly the United States. Do you think the Iranians will do something like that? Because I kind of wonder about that. It was a great show, but nobody in Israel died. Was it effective? Will they do something like that again?
Well, clearly it was not effective if Israel felt emboldened to carry out another provocative attack inside Iran. Last time around, Iran and the United States engaged intensively during that 2-week period between the Israeli attack in Damascus and the Iranian retaliation, and then the Israeli retaliation, in order to manage and calibrate the Iranian response. This was all done through third parties. Iranians have now seen that obviously the United States, much like last time, either didn't know or can't contain Israel's impulse to escalate, and it doesn't have a say in restraining Israel. And so the United States, whatever deterrence existed in the Iranian attack last time in getting Washington much more engaged in managing Israel, hasn't worked. What Iranians are now saying is that they clearly have to do something much more effective against Israel in order to achieve what they didn't achieve last time, which is to make Israel think twice before it escalates, and to really assume that there's a cost to the kind of action they took in Iran. What that might look like is I think, is being debated between Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others, and is also subject of a discussion behind the scenes with the United States. For instance, today, the Jordanian foreign minister went to Iran with a specific message from both the King of Jordan and from the United States, which suggests that this is being discussed even between the United States and Iran.
Robin, very quickly, you've lived in Lebanon for 5 years. How dangerous do you think this situation is? Could you imagine Israel trying to invade Lebanon and reoccupy part of it as it did in the 1980s?
Well, that would be a very dangerous move for Israel because it learned during the 18-year occupation from 1982 to 2000 that it couldn't beat Hezbollah, and it engaged in what was, in 2006, its most difficult war, in which first one that Israel did not win. There's a problem militarily, but I think Vali's right that there will be a multi-pronged operation, that this is very different from what happened in April, and that you'll see activity on multiple fronts. And because of Iran's missile arsenal, because of what Hezbollah has, they have reached what's known as overmatch, the inability of Israel to intercept or prevent all of those drones and missiles from hitting Israel. And the United States will have a critical role in being there militarily to intercept. Remember, it played a huge role in intercepting more than 80 drones and 6 ballistic missiles in April. Israel will have to have the United States militarily on its side in order to prevent serious damage if Israel attacks or Iran attacks.
Robin, it seems to me that the Biden administration is trying to tamp down this crisis, has seemed to signal to Bibi Netanyahu that it would not want to see more aggressive actions, would not back Bibi if he did something. But he has so far called Biden's bluff on a lot of this stuff, expanded the war in Gaza when Biden has put down some red lines. Do you think that A, Biden is really trying to restrain him, and B, will Bibi listen, especially to a president who is no longer even running for re-election?
Fareed, I think President Biden has sent strong messages, some even in public, to Bibi about restraining his military operations, whether it's in Gaza or in the wider Middle East. I don't think Prime Minister Netanyahu is listening. He has his very own agenda, both political and personal. The great danger for the Biden administration is that his time is running out. And there had been talks twice this year in Oman between Iranian and U.S. officials, indirectly conducted by Oman, the diplomat shuttling between the two delegations. So there's some indication that the Biden administration is interested in trying to de-escalate the issue of both regional tensions, Iran strikes, and what its allies are doing across the region, as well as tensions with Israel. Unfortunately, the terms of the nuclear deal are almost obsolete, and it's kind of starting from scratch. The timing of the death of Haniya was particularly difficult because it came on the day that the new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, was inaugurated, and that forced his hand, a man who had been talking about easing relations with the outside world. So for the Biden administration, dealing with the tensions, the very diverse and disparate players is increasingly difficult as the focus in the United States shifts to our own domestic agenda.
Vali, how does this play in Iran? Because you had a very interesting article in Foreign Affairs where you were talking about, with a co-author, where you were talking about how this election of a new president in Iran really signals that the Iranians are trying a new approach. What do you mean?
Well, there is a reformist who won the presidential elections in Iran. He ran on a campaign that he wants to reduce sanctions pressure on Iran, which means ultimately following up on what Robin mentioned, those conversations in Oman continuing until there's some kind of an agreement around issues that the United States has with Iran, nuclear, regional, etc., in exchange for lifting sanctions. But the problem here is that the Israeli policy, and particularly these escalations vis-a-vis Iran, do not create the right environment for that. In fact, going after Haniya on the day of the inauguration of this president who wants to start negotiations with the United States essentially makes it extremely difficult. And the onus is, in some ways, the view of Tehran is that the onus is on the United States to show that it can restrain Israel and prevent it from turning the conversation away from potential and possible negotiation to war. I mean, right now, this president was inaugurated. You would have said that this might have created some kind of a momentum for preliminary conversations, and instead we're talking about a potential war between the United States and Iran, as American warships are going to Iran, and we may end up being in a very different place. So in a way, the United States is actually chasing Israeli policy rather than making its own policy with Iran.
Robin, how likely do you think it is that you mentioned there are 10 different simmering conflicts going on in the Middle East, and they're all sort of coming together? How possible is it that this time, despite the fact that the Iranians don't want a war, despite the fact the Americans don't want a war, most of these players don't want a full-out war, we could actually stumble into one?
Absolutely, and that's the real danger and the real tragedy and irony. But when you look at what's been playing out over the past month with the Houthis firing a drone that hit Tel Aviv, with the kind of resumption of attacks on U.S. forces who are based in Syria and Iraq, for a totally different reason. They're there to try to contain ISIS and the resurgence of ISIS. What Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, said just this week when he threatened that this war is entering a whole new phase. And I think, the guns of August is taking on a whole new meaning. And I think the question is anybody willing to step back? We saw when the U.S. assassinated Soleimani, Iran responded with missiles on U.S. forces, but at the same time sent messages to Washington, no, we want no escalation. In April, again, with the strikes by Israel on Iranian generals in Syria, and then the Iranian response on Israel, there was a sense that was, it was a tit for tat and no further. The question is whether this will end in a tit for tat exchange, retaliation by Iran for Haniyeh's death, and by Hezbollah for the death of its commander in Beirut, or will this continue to unravel at a time when there's no diplomacy and no one's really talking much about Gaza. So we're not even dealing with the basic issue that generated this horrendous challenge.
Robin Wright, Vali Nasser, thank you both so much.